So yesterday, I made a short video in which I mentioned that Christopher Nolan's Odyssey movie actually has a lot less sex in it than the book The Odyssey, and this was one of the complaints of translator Emily Wilson, whose translation Nolan's movie is based on. And I think that is a true statement, but I also think it's an easy one to misinterpret in the modern age. And I gathered from some of the comments that I got in response to that people might have gotten the wrong idea of what I meant by that, and that making a more authentic one would have involved more boobs on screen or a couple extra sex scenes here or there, and it might have, but that's not all that I really was talking about. I want to clarify a little bit. I also want to be clear that I am not nearly as knowledgeable about this stuff as someone like Emily Wilson or someone who's actively studying classics these days, but I did study a lot of this stuff in college. I was a double major in classics and mathematics, and I didn't end up going that route, but I actually had done enough undergraduate work. I very easily could have pursued graduate work in classics and gone on to become a professor and had a similar profession to Emily Wilson. So I'm definitely more than a dabbler in this area, but I haven't actually reread these books and gone back and studied this stuff in a few decades, and my knowledge of it is not very fresh. So I'm going to say some general things about this that might be imperfect memory, and if there are people who are classicists who are actively studying this stuff these days, want to speak up and correct me on or provide a different opinion, I absolutely welcome it. But I do think that it is important to consider the historical context of when the Odyssey is from, and how the mores of the time about both sex and violence were quite different than they are today. Now, there's definitely a lot that's still in common, and I think that's part of what's beautiful about reading a lot of old world literature, is you find that people had similar ideas, similar feelings, similar reactions as across all different generations. But there's also definitely significant differences. And one of those differences, of course, is just that the world was often at war back in those days, and the violence of war was a very sort of known and accepted part of life. And it's certainly the case in the Homeric epics that there is no shying away from describing the horrors of war and the violence of it. Of course, it was a society where women had much less power than men, and was very patriarchal, you could say, in a lot of ways. And of course, the sexual mores of the time were something that's not necessarily all that different from how some people feel nowadays, but to an even stronger degree, valued virginity for women, but not for men in the same way. Is that women were supposed to be pure and faithful to their partners, and that if they were raped or taken or consorted with other man, that this was a sin of the woman's that she could be punished for, regardless of whether she had any agency in that kind of thing happening. It is also the case that it is very much the case in a lot of these old war stories that there were a number of these generals, these people who went and fought in these wars, who seized women as part of their prize. And in fact, that's what started the Trojan War in the first place, right? Was Helen being taken, brought to Troy. And then there are several cases of the story of when the Greeks went and attacked Troy, of them taking particular women back with them. And this was, to a certain degree, an accepted part of the society and culture of the time, but I don't want to oversimplify that either. I think one of the things that's very interesting about a lot of these old Greek texts, and here I'm thinking not so much of the Odyssey, but more the Oresteia, the trilogy of Greek tragedies written by Aeschylus about the Agamemnon story. This is, of course, a really great source of information on this, but these stories far predate Aeschylus writing about them. He was writing about 3 centuries after the Odyssey, and these stories had existed in myth and legend and oral history as told in ways like the Odyssey for a long time. And there's a lot of that story also that's in the Odyssey itself. But part of what's interesting about the Oresteia is the moral ambiguity and complexity of it. Because in this story, Agamemnon, who was really the one who led the entire Greek army to attack Troy on behalf of his brother Menelaus, because Menelaus' wife Helen was stolen, Agamemnon was married to Clytemnestra, who was actually Helen's twin sister. and they are played by the same woman in the movie. And they were not just twins, actually. They were among 4 or 6 different children, depending on the myths, that were apparently all born out of an egg, and have divine parentage, too. So there's a whole lot of not only complexity and mysticism tied up in the story, but there are actually different versions of it, depending on, when and where and who was telling these legends. But a big part of this story is that Agamemnon took his own consort back from the war, who was Cassandra, from Troy, and his wife Clytemnestra was very upset by this. So it's not as simple as saying this was a completely acceptable thing for him to do. It is very much part of the legend that Clytemnestra was angry and jealous about Agamemnon bringing back Cassandra, and she also had been having an illicit affair of her own, and then she plotted the murder of Agamemnon, which is what the first play of the Odyssey is about, and then the following ones are about the revenge that was taken on her after that, and the building of a justice system. And it's not just based on revenge, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that kind of thing, although of course that imagery comes from biblical sources, not from these Greek sources. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a whole lot of sort of gray area and complexity there in terms of, it was definitely the case that men were different expectations of behavior than women, and they were not on an equal footing at all. But to say that it was like completely and totally acceptable for men to take consorts back from war in this way, and it wasn't something that would make the wife irate, is definitely not the case, right? Like, this is a documented part of one of the most famous pieces of Greek literature, that it very much did inflame this wife, that this King Agamemnon brought back this consort. And there were various other Greek generals who brought back consorts from the Trojan War as well, but one that did not was Odysseus. And that is an interesting story too. And I don't mean to make Odysseus sound very pure in all of this. Odysseus is obviously a very complicated character. In fact, that's how Emily Wilson chose to translate the very first line of the Odyssey, to take the word polytropos and say that it was complicated, which I think is a pretty good translation of it, although it was also been used to mean wily or the man of many ways. But the point is that he was not only a very intelligent and foxy and wily sort of character, but he also was significantly different than a lot of the other Greek generals, and sort of set himself apart in a lot of ways. And one thing that actually does sort of set him apart is his loyalty to his wife. And it's kind of funny to say that, because in the story, he did have sexual affairs with both Calypso and Circe. And in fact, the story with Circe is much larger in the book than in the movie. He went back to Circe a couple of different times over the course of a few years. And in the movie version, of course, there is not depicted a sexual relationship between Circe and Odysseus, only between Calypso and Odysseus. And I do think that one thing that the movie does depict pretty well is that in the case of Calypso, it really was not a voluntary thing on Odysseus' part. She was controlling him. She was feeding him lotus flowers to make him forget. And he had no idea how long he was there, and it wasn't a really voluntary situation. In a lot of ways, you could say he did not have consent. And it is actually described in the poem the ways in which he was pining for his wife, and he was not even enjoying it a lot of the time that he was with Calypso, whether you want to believe that or not. But the point is not to say to defend Odysseus here and to say that he was sort of, a more ideal person or anything like that. But it's to say that he was different than a lot of the other Greek generals and people in this myth, and that he was someone who, even though he did sort of participate in not having to be faithful to his wife in the ways that would have been expected of her, he was someone who was to some degree more faithful in terms of all of the relationships that he had were ones where he did not have full agency, where it was a goddess, a nymph Calypso, and then it was a sorceress Circe who was taking advantage of him in some ways. And you could say that it wasn't entirely like his arm was twisted with Circe. She did turn his men into pigs, and he was doing what he had to rescue them. But he also was like formed an allyship with her. She very much helped him on numerous occasions in terms of having to navigate the seas and the troubles that he would have to deal with, like Scylla and Charybdis. So you could say that he was using his sexual favors with her even for some advantage to help him in solving the puzzles and overcoming the challenges that he needed to get home eventually. But at the same time, there was an absolute expectation that his wife Penelope was supposed to be being faithful. And it's not just Penelope. One thing that's interesting in the story with the suitors is that it's kind of, there's a dramatic compression in the movie of there's only this one suitor, Antinous, who is sort of, one of the leaders of the suitors, one of the lead bad guys in the movie there, who is shown to be having an affair with one of her maidservants. But in the actual book, there were a whole group of maidservants who were having affairs with many of the suitors. And it was the case when Odysseus finally revealed himself and killed all the suitors, that it was only Odysseus. It was not his son Menelaus aiding him. He was the one whose hand all the suitors died by. But actually part of the original story is that while this was happening, Telemachus actually hung all of the female maidservants who had been sleeping with the suitors and helping them conspire in some ways. And it was the case that, their sexual impurity with these suitors was enough of an offense that merited death on their part in this ancient Greek culture and in this myth. And I think this is a great example of, this is why I don't think a literal interpretation of this is necessarily the way that Christopher Nolan wanted to go. I think that if he had been making a movie in which he told that story as is, where there was a lot of blood on Telemachus' hands, and it was always the blood of women, in particular for their sexual impurities, and it was this whole group of women who had been, sleeping with these suitors, I feel like that would have set off modern audiences in a lot of ways and would have been received very differently than it was by the Greeks in the time that were hearing and then eventually reading Homer's epics. So I think it was, whether you agree with it or not, I think it was a very intentional choice by Christopher Nolan to de-emphasize some of these sexual aspects of the story and to focus more on other aspects of the story, because he knew that there would be a lot of shock value, there would be a lot of foreignness to modern audiences if they had seen these stories, people depicted in this way. Characters, for instance, such as Telemachus, Odysseus' own son, would be seen in a much less positive light because of this. So I think, Nolan had to make the choices he made to emphasize the aspects of the Odyssey he wanted to. It's a huge book with a whole lot going on. There's no way to capture all of that in a 3-hour movie. And he had to make the choices about which particular things he wanted to emphasize, which things he wanted to de-emphasize. And, also, having a little less of the Circe story to give more time for other things, I think was a reasonable choice. He might have also been thinking that the question of Odysseus having other sexual relations was already addressed with the Calypso story, didn't really need to be addressed by the Circe story in his movie too. And, as is often the case in these kind of movies, there's sort of dramatic compression in having just one maidservant who was having an unfaithful affair with one of the suitors rather than a whole host of them. So I think these were reasonable compromises on Nolan's part to make the movie he wanted to make. At the same time, I don't, think that Emily Wilson's opinion is invalid. Like, she could have wanted a more literal interpretation of the book. But I think we also have to consider that he's making a movie not just for people who fully understand the era in which Homer is writing and who are ever going to read the book. He is making a movie for modern audiences that some of whom might be inspired to read the book, and that's great if it gets more people reading ancient literature, but who knows that many of these people are never going to go and read this epic poem, and many of these people are going to see this more through a cultural and historical lens of modern day rather than these ancient times. So, in my opinion, I think Nolan made some reasonable compromises in terms of what he wanted to do and emphasize in the movie. Thanks for listening.